So whenever I was watching that high school team in Minnesota to watch Mike Kester, Pitlick was always the guy that was sticking out more. And so when Kester kind of slipped in the draft relative to what people were expecting, and Pitlick, I think Pitlick went before Kester, I wasn't super surprised. And Montreal, it's just another one of those guys where Montreal seems to value those quick, speedy, aggressive energy guys. Um, and it's either that or they value the like Greek Adonises who are 220 pounds of muscle. And I guess what they're hoping is that maybe Rhett Pitlick can put on
You're
that
talking.
extra weight and get to 200 pounds and be one of those physical energy guys that actually can move around the ice. So it's an interesting strategy, but Pitlick is the guy that I would definitely toss in there as an answer to your question.
So I have a question as someone that has pretty much predominantly just watched the NHL in the past, uh, and trying to get into prospects and analysis like that is really daunting because there's just so much out there, so many different leagues, AHL, OHL, WHL, the Q, everything. It's really intimidating to try and get into. So I guess what would you suggest? Like, and there's so much analysis out there from TSN to Sports Center to people like you, independent people online. Where do you really start on something like that?
Um, well, I'll tell you what I did. I mean, I started slow. Obviously, you obviously there is 100% a Dunning-Kruger effect going on in pretty much every industry ever, but scouting, it definitely exists where you start off thinking you're smarter than everybody and you know more, and then you make some bets and you say some dumb things that make you look dumb. I did that. I still do that. And then over time, you realize that was dumb and here's why. That was dumb and here's why. Or I should have trusted myself here and here's why. But to bring it all the way back to the beginning, I honestly, like, I never played high level hockey whatsoever. I was actually a terrible hockey player, and I still am terrible. But I love hockey, and I've always loved it, and I always have been a very analytical person. And the way that I kind of got into it was honestly, I just wanted to watch more hockey around the world and see where all these guys were coming from, and that I felt that there was a gap in analysis in the NHL draft. So I figured, let's start from scratch and see where it goes. So what I did was I sort of said, all right, I'm going to forget about every hockey game I've ever watched. Like, just pretend I've never seen hockey before and just sit back and just, watch whatever. So I was watching, one thing I really like to do is watch back in those days, like watch really bad teams play really good teams and just identify what that looks like. Like, what is a bad team and why? Or what is a good team and why? And then identifying what two good teams playing against each other looks like. And when they're, what makes good players stand out when they're playing good teams, and how to identify factors that can at least help, because all of this is about probability. Like, I don't think there's one magical formula where you can identify a player and say this player is objectively better than this player, or this prospect is objectively better than this. You can deal with the probability, and there are factors that push guys closer to the top of my board for sure. But again, it's more about developing your eye and watching as much as you can, and really, again, for me, it was like deconstructing and then reconstructing how I watch the game and how I perceive the events that go on the ice. Like, I quickly, it's hard to. One question that I asked myself pretty early on that I think every person who wants to get into hockey analysis really should ask themselves is like, what does a good hockey player look like? Like, what there's no one answer, but it's good to know if you're watching an NHL game, like who are the players on the ice that are succeeding the most often and why, and how are they doing it? And just going from there can sort of get you on the right track. And when it comes to watching games, I mean, I started relatively small. Russian junior hockey is free on YouTube. Russian minor hockey is free on YouTube. I started with those. My first video was Pavel Durofiev, and all of that was me manually watching 3 hour long YouTube videos and tracking data and scanning through it all for when he was on the ice. And then that leads into that led into hockey TV for me, where they have the USHL, NAHL, NTDP in the US, all the junior A hockey you could ever want. And that's where the Alex Newhook video came from. So really, it was just trying to watch as much hockey as I could find per dollar without spending like $800 on a bunch of different streaming packages and trying to cover absolutely everyone at once. And that was really sort of the biggest starting point for me. And then over time, once I landed with Dauber and they offered me a spot covering Minnesota, that helped me also talk to other people and get to know other people and how they think about the game and refine what I think. And then over time, companies like Instat come along where you can watch pretty much anyone you want and it's all tagged so you can identify them by ice time, and it's for scouts, and that's a service where I've luckily been able to gain access to it, and that makes viewing a lot easier. But in the olden days, as I would call it, like 4 years ago, it was a lot of manual YouTube watching, and Hockey TV was a big resource for me. And it was just really watch as much as possible and just try to pick up on what makes good players great. And even in prospects, like just forgetting for a while in 2019 that Jack Hughes was the number one guy. I would just watch Jack Hughes and go, okay, but why? Like, why do scouts love Jack Hughes so much? And not just listen to what other people had to say, but like see it for myself and actually watch, and just sort of build, because then there could be a time where you sit back and go, I don't think I agree. And that's when you can start to really refine things, is when you start to develop your eye for what to look for. And then you might look at a player, maybe not Jack Hughes specifically, but there have been players in the 2019, 2020, 2021 draft where I'm going, I don't see it. And you have to be willing to stick your stake in the mud there and go, I don't see it. And then if you're right, that's one thing. And if you're not right, that's a whole other thing. And balancing all that together is kind of the really hard part, and you may never get it right. I don't think I'm quite getting it right every single time. But it's all about just figuring it out as you go, kind of. And just, for me, it was not about biting off more than I can chew right off the bat. And then over the last few years, it's just kind of settled into a rhythm where I can cover almost. There are still players that get drafted that I've never seen before in my life, but the majority of them, I'm at least aware of their existence, which to me is good. That's okay.
Will Scouch is chatting with us along with Sebastian Hyde, Joshua Rosa, and Scott Cowan. Will, one of the we were talking off air about the Q actually, and the Gatineau Olympic, more specifically, and something that a really interesting scenario happened in 2020 when they had not one but 4 first-round picks, which is absolutely bananas. And I can't imagine an NHL team having 4 first-round picks and, well, failing. But, there are certain teams who are prone to that, and we're not going to name them. But they drafted Tristan Luneau, Anthony Vero, Samuel Savoie, and a defenseman that I'm becoming a very big fan of is Noah Warren. Mm-hmm. Can you give us maybe your thoughts on these players, and also maybe like the impact that it could have on a team, regardless of the level, that with picking 4 first-round picks?
Yeah. So just to go over those guys, I mean, I've only seen them in very brief spurts this year. It's still very early in the year. But I've seen a lot of Antonin Véro over the last 2 years. I watched him at the Youth Olympic Games last year and thought he looked really interesting. The thing about, we'll start with him. Like, the thing about him that's really strange is that he's 5'8", and I'm usually the kind of person who can set size aside, and I go, you know what? It's only one piece of the puzzle, but it does mean that if you're on the smaller side, you need to make up for it in other ways.
You have to skate to begin with.
Yes, and if you're on the other side of the spectrum, if you're gigantic, you need to have other things that make up that, because there are disadvantages to being big as well.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that every NHL prospect needs to be 6 feet and that there's that sweet spot there. But again, it's so much about developing your philosophy, is weighing all of those pros and cons of all of these different variables that can be within one player. So skating, size, intelligence, all those things. Like, you can be the smartest hockey player in the world and not a great skater and still find your way into the NHL. It's hard, but it's possible. Yeah. And that can be said for guys who can skate and maybe don't move the puck super well, or guys who, whatever. There's all kinds of stuff. And with Véro, he's, I see a lot of quickness and skill out of him, but the whole thing with me is that if you're that small, it's got to be like 10 out of 10. Like, you've got, like, Logan Stankoven last year was a guy that I loved. Yeah. And his energy level, his momentum, his speed, his skill, his shot quality, his playmaking were all just banging. Like, they were sick. And the rest of his game, like, he's not the most physical player, but he makes up for it in many other ways. And he tries, which is another thing I look for in really small players. Even if you're not the most physical player, there's so many things that you can benefit in hockey from if you just apply pressure to your opponent. You don't need to kill them. It's just make them make decisions that they don't want to make. And that can cause a lot of issues. And there's a bit of that in Vigo. So he's a guy that I think right now, just preemptively, is in my second round. I have an eye on him, and I'll definitely do a couple of games on him at least this year. But I wouldn't be surprised if he's one of these sort of smaller guys that ends up going like late second, early third round, where a team's just taking a flyer on him and says, look, if the skill level can figure itself out, if he gets stronger, if he gets, quicker on his feet, then maybe there's something else there. And I like him. You mentioned Noah Warren. I've been a fan of him as well. I mean, again, similar to Vero, I'm not sure he's like a 10 out of 10 player, but I liked the sort of maturity in his game from last year. He moves pretty well as well for a guy that size. Most of what I've seen of him was from last year, where the production and ice time was a little bit more limited. So I am looking forward to seeing what he can do this year, because I think, again, with defensemen, I kind of set size aside, but there is definitely an advantage to having defensemen that are 6'3", 6'4", mobile, and they can use their stick before they rely on physical play. Like, a reason I love, or not love, I would say, but really like Caden Gooley as a prospect is because he's that big physical guy, but he's not out there doing that constantly all of the time. He relies on stick play first, and then the physical play comes second, because physical play can remove him from play. But if he can just use the stick and turn a play over, then that's great. And I see a little bit of that in Noah Warren as well, where there's that mobility, but not mobile and physical to the point of making himself a defensive liability by creating a bunch of empty space when he goes chasing for hits. So I'll be curious to see how he plays for the rest of the year. Tristan Luneau is one where he's not a bad player. Again, another one of these sort of smart and poised defensemen overall, but I've never been super blown away with his game. Maybe that's changed this year. I can't say I've seen a ton of him yet this year, but I will. And Savoie, I honestly can't tell you much. I haven't seen a ton of Samuel Savoie, but when you mention 4 first-round picks in one QMJHL draft, I mean, that's exciting, I think, more than anything.
Oh, yeah.
And a guy like Vero is exciting. I've liked Warren for what he is, and I think, the more you watch a lot of young players playing hockey around the world, the more you realize that certain types of players, like, they just kind of stick out because of who else is in the league with them. And Noah Warren, I think, is a big, mobile, sort of decently skilled defenseman in a QMJHL filled with defensemen who are not particularly great defenders. It's a pretty passive league, relatively. And so when players play like Noah Warren, it, to me, sticks out a lot more. And that's another thing that you have to be aware of. Like, I watch a lot of Russian junior hockey. And then there is, a guy like Prokhor Poltapov last year, who is physical and intense all the time, but in a world where nobody plays like that. So obviously it's going to stick out, and he's a fine player. But again, with especially the Quebec League, in my experience, like, you got to set your bar high. But 4 first-round picks is really exciting, and they do look like a pretty decent team, even though I believe they've lost 4 straight to start the year, 3 straight. But they're kind of fun, and there are definitely some exciting names on that team. So I'll have my eye on the Olympique for most of this year. But yeah, a group of interesting players for sure.
So on the show here, we've talked at length extensively about Montreal's last first round, and we're not going to mention it by name or anything, but
well, you can if you want to, Josh. You like to live dangerously, man.
I can live dangerously.
I hated that so much.
We all don't agree with it. Yeah. So
open Pandora's box, my friend. His name is.
Oh boy.
Hey.
Not much.
Turner shall not be.
Turner Stevenson.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Turner Stevenson.
Turner Stevenson, yes. Lindsay Vallis. Can we just keep naming failed Habs first round picks?
Yeah. There you go.
So if you're Trevor Timmins or Mark Bergevin, who are you taking 31st overall in the first round?
Let me check. I mean, I really thought it was going to be Logan Stankoven. I really, really did. I honestly thought that was who it was going to be. The Habs don't shy away from small players, and I really thought that guy would check so many boxes for what the Habs are looking for. Like, You have Brendan Gallagher on your team. You just look at Brendan Gallagher and go, see, here's another Western boy who everybody said was too small and was drafted way too late. Here's your roommate, Logan, and learn everything you possibly can from this guy all summer long. That's not the direction that